Master Dance Bosch, and I want to talk about the latest development of the chess drama that happened. So I have to put you up to speed. If you haven't seen it, we'll be able to check the previous video I did on this one. So Magnus quit the Sinkfield Cup, and then he posted a meme of a Mourinho meme, and then insinuations started that, and of course, gossip on the internet that they assume that Hans Niemann is accused there of cheating, and then people started to extrapolate from all what they've seen and interviews that Hans gave. Now, as I said, I talked about this earlier, and I will provide some links that we've just got in. So, all the brand new information that we have on this topic. Now, we've got a game on our hands. This is game 6 between Hans Niemann and Wesley So, which of course I'm going to show and show some key moments of that game. Also, a little bit of the players, just giving you an idea of what's happening there. Now, first, a couple of statements that actually happened and happened not long ago. First, we had a Hans Niemann interview after his game against Lenny Dominguez, which was already very hard fought and probably the first difficult game for him that event after his game and victory against the reigning world champion Magnus Carlsen. And there he actually lashed out and defended himself. He actually felt accused by Hikaru Nakamura, Carlsen, and Chess.com, although he did admit to be cheating at age 12 and 16, but to his own account, not anything of a event that was very important. And he then did send some messages out on Twitter that the silence speaks for itself, as there were no further information at that time. However, later in the afternoon, chess.com did issue a statement that they listened and they removed him from the Global Chess Championship, which actually Hans did allude to and that he was surprised to see. And chess.com in that statement said that they found contradictory evidence what Hans said in the interview, and they invite him to tell him what he sees differently. That's the first one. So we had the Hans interview, then chess.com. Actually, before chess.com, there was Hikaru's statement. Hikaru responded and actually did take a look at Hans doing the interview. So back in the move order, it was first Hans interview, Hikaru. Hikaru said that he did find plausible what Hans was believing, or Hans was saying, that the transpositions and finding the idea that Carlsen played is possible. So he found it very much plausible. In fact, mentioned that Daniil Dubov, Carlsen's longtime second, has played very similarly in that system. In fact, I am going to show it to you in this very moment. So he actually mentioned that this can be reached via a Catalan move order here, knight c3. So knight c3 here, where usually everyone and their grandfather would go bishop d2. Knight c3 castles, bishop g2, d takes a3, and we basically directly transpose to what we now know as the Carlsen Hans Niemann game. Now, he also said that he did not accuse Hikaru. Hikaru says that he didn't accuse Hans, and instead He said he was just alluding to the online ones, the ones that was admitted. So he mostly was reflecting on those chess.com bans, not that he cheated over the board. And he was urging and was waiting for statements from chess.com and from Magnus Carlsen. And after this one, after what Hikaru said, came the chess.com statement that they found it contradictory of what they believed, and they removed him from the Global Chess Championship for that very reason. And then they're open to talk to Hans about it. So those are the big three things that happened. There are some other news we found out in an ABC article, an article that is published in Australia, that Kenneth Regan is doing research, statistical research, whether there is a reason to believe that Hans did cheat or not. He did not find any evidence. That article I'm going to link as well. So, as I promised, I want to look at the game and talk a bit about the psychological situation before the game. So, Hans is playing Wesley So, and this is round 6, and this has been played after the Dominguez game. Dominguez actually had a very good chance to beat Hans the previous round, but Hans, with very steady defense, managed to turn it around and achieve a draw. So you might be noticing that since round 3, there has been going a downward spiral for Hans, as he's not actually getting the positions and the results he'd like to have. In fact, against Dominguez, against Wesley, he hasn't been hitting peak form. So e4, e5, a very solid choice by Wesley, which is not surprising. He is actually one of the biggest favorites in the upcoming years, as Magnus is more and more likely to retire, to become a world championship challenger and potentially a world champion. Knight f3, knight f6, one of the most solid systems. The other solid systems that is very popular on the top is the Berlin defense. But he goes for knight f6, which is somewhat less popular, even though it featured in World Championship match recently between Carlsen and Caruana, but previously between the never-ending rivalry between Kasparov and Karpov. Karpov actually playing on the black side. Knight takes c5, d6, knight f3, knight takes c4, d4. Not the most aggressive approach, which actually was more of vintage Hans. Hans played very, very aggressively against Firouzja and almost got rewarded for it. Had an advantage, but it did fizzle out in a draw. He had a very, very aggressive play against Shahman Magyarov, but this time he's going for solid. If we're looking for an aggressive approach, it's knight to c3, ruining the structure, but actually attempting to go out and go play castle along queen d2, knight d7. And this actually has been a game played between Fabiano Caruana and Lenier Dominguez in the Sinkfield Cup. Now, Niemann decides to go for d4, d5, bishop d3, bishop f5, a much more rare approach, but the one that I've seen by Karpov as well. The old line is bishop e7, castle, knight c6, and this has been featured plenty of times in the Karpov matches. Bishop f5, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, knight d2. Now, and this is very solid play by Hans, but still very good preparation. All engine approved, but of course that is very normal at this level. Knight d6, knight f1, c6, bishop f4. Bishop f4 is clever. It's basically putting pressure on this structure. So if Wesley would ignore it, then bishop takes d6, and that will destroy black structure. because after bishop takes d3, bishop takes e7 is an in-between move, and black just loses. So Vesely has to give up the bishop over here, just trade it, takes knight a6. Knight d7 has been played by another expert of this variation, that's Jan Krzysztof Duda, who's also a player of the top and played in the recent candidates event. Knight a6. Knight a6 is actually attempting to go the long route and go knight c7, knight e6, just blocking off this e-file that actually under Hans's control. Knight e3, knight c7, 3, knight e6, bishop e5, and so far very stellar preparation by Hans. He has the control of the e-file. He is preparing to break through with c4, but black's play has been very solid, and that is actually typical Vesely. So he's a very, very solid and sound player. There are semblance of Karpovian or Carlsen-like chess, if you will, and of course he is the reigning Fischer champion. So the Fischer 960, which is a form of chess where you do not have openings. And in fact, that World Championship is going to happen in a couple of months. Now, here he realizes that the big problem in his position is the d5 pawn. So he decides to go knight to e4 with the idea of rerouting this knight from d6 to a much, much better square to overprotect on d5. c4, knight f6. Now there is firm protection here, and as long as he holds on d5, he is maybe going to be a slightly bit worse, but not by a lot. Rook d1, d6, d, a6, and this is typical play from the black side, just over defending these squares, making sure that white never really has ideas as queen b5 in the long run. Here, of course, knight takes d5 is annoying, but in that case, white isn't really having any sort of advantage. g3, a6, but as a protective measure, Vesely so is making sure that there's no b5 square for white. Rook e2, and here, interestingly, Hans should have played h4 earlier, because if you go knight h5, as happens in a couple of moves, white does have knight g4, threatening mate n1. Of course, very, very dangerous. But if f6, then there's bishop takes f6, which works spectacularly. There is these rook takes e6 ideas. You take here, check on h6, here takes, and there is this tactical justification of hitting on h6 and e7 at the same time. So h4 would have been an interesting idea. He decides to play rook e2 first, rook e8, h4, knight h5, but this is actually a decisive difference because in this scenario, the knight is going to be defended. So if knight g4, f6, bishop takes f6 is not possible because the rook is right there defending the knight. In fact, if rook e1, Vesely did consider a move such as bishop f8, because if you take, knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, knight takes g4, you do not have any tactical shots and waves to prove your position. And with bishop f8, he takes away any of those checks that would possibly in Hans's mind. Knight h5. And in this position, Hans was already under pressure. He had 35 minutes versus an hour, and a tough spot, as with this classy move, his bishop actually is entrapped. It's very difficult to get it out. Now, this move, which was suggested here by the computer, is impossible to find. The move is b4. That was the only way to hold on to this position. And after f6, c takes d5, c takes d5, queen b3. White should have gave up the piece, but for what is a huge compensation, knight takes d5 or knight takes e5. And in both cases, this king is in the middle, and there is a lot of play for the sacrificed piece. Now, it turns out that was not what Hans was having in mind. Took, knight g2. Very human decision there, trying to somehow excavate this bishop. f6, bishop b8. And surprisingly enough, if Wesley chooses either rook takes or queen takes, white is actually the one who's better because the structure is somewhat loose now for black and the d5 pawn is a target as well. However, Wesley is known to be very accurate, and king f7 is the golden move that he finds over defending this square and giving him the option to capture on b8 with any of those pieces, which of course will be crucial as you'll see. g4, and here queen takes b8, and that's the key. So with the king heavily defending that knight, this queen is free to roam, and with this knight f4 idea being possible, he is taking over, and black's advantage is of course in no question. Captures, captures, and of course h5 is a typical idea here, but h5 just does not work because of queen g4 check, and Wesley is just going to pick up the pawn. Rook e1, bishop d6, and because of the king's side being weak and the pawns being all scattered, black is just better. Rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen g4, which is an important intermezzo over defending the pawn, and then he's going to take on e8. f1 takes a4, king f7, bishop f4. Here, Wesley mentioned bishop b4, where he's going to protect all of those squares and sort of restricting the defensive potential for Hans. In d3, check, queen e6, queen e4, and this is actually very difficult defense for Hans because once this king ventures inside on g4, the h-pawn is more likely than not to fall. Queen c3, bishop d6, a very unhurried response, typical of Wesley. He is still waiting for Hans to show his plans. d2, check, king e7, queen f5, just putting his pieces to better spots. Thank you for subscribing there. Appreciate it very much, Skabix. Queen e3. Oh, we jumped over here. Queen e3, queen e4, king e2, bishop h2, knight f3, and bishop f4. This is the moment he feels is the right time to trade the queens. Takes, takes, knight e1, king e6, bishop b8, and this is the typical rule of two weaknesses. That's just enough for black to win the game. And of course, black has the bishop versus the knight, which is always advantageous when the pawns are on both sides of the board. Pawns are far away, and it's very difficult for this knight to be on both places. Bishop a7, king d6, king e5, again restricting. He is much more interested in this knight being passive than actually capturing pawns on his own. Now he captures knight f4, g5, knight h3, knight g5, king e5, king f4, again over defending the pawns and going after the f2 pawn. King f1, now knight d6 already loses because of e3, takes, takes, and this pawn promotes to a lady. Bishop b6, again unhurriedly taking away some squares. Knight d6, king f3. Now also remember, if you don't wait here, king f3, then there are checks for Hans to keep this king at bay. So he's waiting for attack, king f3. Now there are no more checks. The threat on f2 is humongous. Knight c4 captures, check, king f4, and there's a tactical trick. So king f2 loses. Therefore, here, Hans resigned. So we've got all these news out. This is the first loss for Hans in this event. So we've got statements from Hikaru, from chess.com, and of course Hans himself. And we yet to hear from Magnus Carlsen. We wonder if we're going to hear anything from him, but time will tell for sure. For now, what we can say about the event, Wesley So takes the lead, and he's been on a steady trajectory to win the Singfield Cup. Hans has been on a downward spiral since against Dominguez He's been struggling but managed to hold. But this time, Vesely actually showed some very, very, very solid play. And you gotta give that. Pizza Racer, thank you for the sub. And you gotta say, this was a very, very difficult game for Hunts as Vesely showed some outstanding class and positional understanding in this game. So, what is going to happen? Really, time will tell. I will provide links below, and the previous video you can also check out. So, thank you so much for watching, and do check back in, and I will update you if there's any news. Thank you for watching.